In today's video, we're going to continue our study of musical intervals. Last week, we laid the foundation for how we think and speak about intervals, and we also introduced two interval qualities, perfect and major. Today, we're going to learn about the remaining three qualities of intervals, and we're also going to complete the reference chart that we started last time. So by the end of the video today, we'll have a helpful resource that we can use going forward. Today's video is a little bit shorter than the others, but it's still chock full of great information. So grab your notebook and something to write with, and let's get right into the good stuff. Let's start with a quick recap of the intervals we learned about last week. We looked at interval sizes from unisons to octaves and every size in between. And we labeled each of those sizes as either perfect or major. To be a little more specific, our perfect intervals were perfect unisons, perfect fourths, perfect fifths, and perfect octaves. And our major intervals were major seconds, major thirds, major sixths, and major sevenths. Now, this division is going to hold true as we go forward. You're never going to hear major fourth or perfect third. So I recommend memorizing these two groups now. One of the surprising things we discovered last week came to us in the form of the major scale. As it turns out, every perfect or major interval that we studied last week occurs naturally right there in the major scale, simply by connecting do to each of the other pitches in the scale. On the screen now, you can see first each of our perfect intervals, formed between do and do, fa, sol, and the octave do. And now, you can see each of the major intervals, formed between do and re, mi, la, and ti. Equipped with this knowledge, we're ready to introduce the remaining three qualities of intervals. Each one of these new qualities can be thought of as an alteration to the intervals we've already learned. So let's begin by seeing how the major intervals could be manipulated. The first quality we'll study today is called the minor interval. Any major interval that is reduced by a half step but maintains its current interval size becomes a minor interval. In other words, the position of the notes on the staff doesn't change, but an accidental is applied to either one note or the other, and this causes the new interval to be reduced by one half step. This new interval will still have the same size. It's either a second, third, sixth, or seventh still, but it will now be labeled as a minor interval. Let's see how this would affect the examples of the major intervals we've been using so far. In our C major scale, we found a major second between scale degrees 1 and 2, or do to re. Now, as a side note, today I'm going to be using scale degrees to refer to pitches more often than I use solfege syllables. And that's because we would need to use solfege syllables that we haven't studied yet, and we won't study for a little while longer. Scale degrees will cover that for us today. Now, back to our example. We have a major second here. Two notes separated on the staff by two positions and containing two half steps between them. Now, if we maintain the size by keeping our positions on C and D, but reduce the number of half steps by making it D flat, we now have a minor second. You can hear an example played now. The exact same process can be applied to each of the remaining major intervals. A major third, which occurs naturally between scale degrees 1 and 3, is two notes separated by 3 positions on the staff and containing 4 half steps. If we lower the third scale degree by adding an accidental, now our two notes only contain 3 half steps between them, while still retaining the size of a third. So now, it's a minor third. You can hear an example played now. A major sixth occurs between scale degrees 1 and 6, and it contains 9 half steps. Reducing that to 8 half steps, while maintaining the current size of a sixth, gives us a minor sixth. Take a listen to the example played now. And a major seventh, found naturally between scale degrees 1 and 7, contains 11 half steps, just 1 semitone shy of a complete octave. If we keep the note heads in the same position, but shrink this interval down to 10 half steps, then, you guessed it, you're looking at a minor seventh. Hear the example played now. Now, taken together, these are the complete set of minor intervals that we'll study. If you can remember your major intervals, which is made easier through memorizing their appearance in the major scale, then minor intervals are only a half step away. Simply use an accidental to shrink the interval by a half step, and voila, you have a minor interval. Before we go on, let's pull up our intervals chart that we began last week and add the minor intervals that we just introduced. You can see how they take their place next to each major interval of the corresponding size, and you can also see that there's just one interval left for us to label. Sitting there between the perfect fourth and the perfect fifth, and dividing the octave perfectly in half with 6 half steps, our mystery interval brings us to our final pair of interval qualities. We're going to cover these last 2 interval qualities in the same section, since really they go together hand in hand. Let's try to find a way to reach the last remaining interval on our chart. We need it to have 6 half steps, so if we use C4, middle C, as our bottom note like we have been so far, then the top note is going to be either F sharp or G flat, depending on how we choose to spell it. That will make this interval either a fourth or a fifth, though the quality is yet to be determined. Earlier, when we were trying to reach the pitches between scale degrees, we were able to shrink the major intervals down to minor intervals by removing 1 half step. Similarly, minor intervals can be made into major intervals if they are enlarged by a half step. But that only works between major and minor intervals. When we go to spell this last interval, we have to approach it from either the perfect fourth below or the perfect fifth above. So what are we going to do? Well, that's where augmented and diminished intervals come into the picture. Any perfect interval, so long as it maintains the same interval size, can be enlarged by a half step to become an augmented interval. And likewise, any perfect interval can also be reduced by a half step to become a diminished interval. In our case, we can take our perfect fourth, formed between C and F, add a half step by changing it to F sharp, and now we have an augmented fourth. 2 notes separated by 4 positions on the staff and containing 6 half steps. You can hear an example played now. Alternatively, we can take our perfect fifth, formed between C and G, remove a half step by changing it to G flat, And now we're left looking at a diminished fifth. Two notes separated by 5 positions on the staff and again containing 6 half steps. Since this is enharmonic to an augmented fourth, it'll sound exactly the same. But go ahead and take a listen to this interval as well. So with the addition of our final 2 qualities, augmented and diminished, we can now name every interval within the span of an octave. Let's bring back our interval chart and add our final interval, which turned out to be 2 intervals after all. While we're at it, go ahead and pause the video to copy this down into your notebook. It's truly one of the best reference tools for our course of study, right up there alongside the circle of fifths. Any perfect interval can be either augmented or diminished simply by maintaining the size of the interval while either adding a half step, augmenting it, or removing a half step, diminishing it. We augmented a perfect fourth and diminished a perfect fifth, and we could do the same thing to unisons and octaves too. And as it turns out, we can perform this operation on our major and minor intervals as well. Now, a major interval, so long as the position of the notes on the staff remains unchanged, can be enlarged by a half step to become an augmented interval. Likewise, a minor interval can be reduced by a half step once again to become a diminished interval, as long as the notes do not move up or down on the staff. Now, in these cases, you are much more likely to encounter double accidentals in order to spell the intervals correctly. It's also worth mentioning that while only certain interval sizes can be labeled as perfect, while the others can be labeled as major or minor, any interval of any size can be labeled as augmented or diminished. Before we take our break today, I want to pull up a variation of our intervals chart so we can showcase our new augmented and diminished intervals. On the left side of the screen, we see our intervals organized according to the number of half steps they contain and labeled with their size and quality. Now add to that, on the right side of the screen, a new chart that shows how each of these intervals could be respelled using either an augmented or a diminished interval. In each case, the corresponding intervals contain the same number of half steps. However, they're spelled using different enharmonic equivalents, and that affects the size of the interval. For an example, a major third is spelled C to E, but using an enharmonic equivalent, we can respell it as C to F flat. Now, while it still contains only 4 half steps, the size has changed from a third to a fourth. As we know already, a perfect fourth contains 5 half steps. So in the case of C to F flat, a fourth containing 4 half steps, we'll label this as a diminished fourth. You don't have to copy down or memorize this new chart of all these enharmonic spellings. But I just think it's kind of neat to see how every interval that we've studied so far can be respelled to take the form of either an augmented or a diminished interval. The possibilities are endless. We're going to take our intermission here, and when we come back, we'll introduce a foolproof 2-step process for building intervals of any size and quality. And then we'll wrap up with an introduction to inversions. So hit pause on the next screen to get some water or grab some orange slices, and we got more knowledge after the break. We've now studied every possible interval that you can form within the span of an octave. We can describe these intervals in terms of size as determined by the position of the notes on the staff and quality, which is determined by the number of half steps that the two pitches contain in between them. So now that we can analyze intervals successfully, let's turn our attention to building intervals. When you're given a starting pitch and asked to form a particular interval, it's our job to provide a second pitch that correctly spells out the requested interval. There's only going to be one right answer to this question, since as we've demonstrated time and time again, enharmonic equivalents are not interchangeable. In times like these, we have an easy, two-step process for building intervals of any size and any quality from absolutely any starting pitch. In this first example, we're given a starting pitch of D natural, and we're asked to provide a second pitch that will form a major third above it. Step 1. Deal with size and ignore quality. Here, we need to construct a third, never mind what quality. Whether you want to think in terms of lines and spaces, counting the musical alphabet, or running through the scale degrees, we just need to move up 3 positions, including our starting one. So let's use the musical alphabet in this case. Beginning from D, we go D, E, F. And so we'll draw an F on the staff. Now we've outlined a third, and step 1 is complete. Step 2. Now it's time to address the quality. Thirds can be diminished, minor, major, or augmented. And these are distinguished from one another by the number of half steps that the interval contains. Here, we're asked to build a major third, and a quick glance at our intervals chart tells us that we'll need 4 half steps here. Now, it can be helpful at first to use the musical keyboard to help you out. And by placing your finger on D and then counting each time your finger moves to the next adjacent key, we arrive on this black key as we count our 4th half step. In step 1, we determined that we must spell this note using F, so here we'll add an accidental and make it F sharp. Proofreading our work, D to F sharp checks both our requirements set forth by the name major third. D, E, F spans the size of a third, and D to F sharp contains 4 half steps. Let's try building another interval. This time, we're giving the starting pitch of G sharp, and we're asked to form a major 7th above it. Okay, step 1, establish the size of the interval. Although our starting pitch has an accidental on it, that won't affect its position on the staff. So all we need to do here is count up 7 positions from G, including our starting note. That takes us from G to A, B, C, D, E, F. So we can put an F on the staff and move to step 2 now. Step 2, now we need to address the number of half steps between our pitches. And now our accidentals come back into play. According to our interval chart, a major 7th will require 11 half steps. So begin by placing your finger on the key for G sharp, and as you move to the next key, count 1, 2, 3, and so on. As you count your 11th half step, you'll be landing on the key highlighted here on the screen. Now, under other circumstances, you might label this key with the letter G, and you'd usually be correct. But in our case, we just determined in step 1 that this note has to be spelled using an F. So as unusual as it may seem, we're going to use a double accidental here. The only correct spelling of a major 7th above G sharp is F double sharp. In the final portion of today's video, we're going to introduce inversions. When we invert an interval, we're simply turning it upside down so that the lower pitch becomes the higher pitch, or vice versa. The pitch classes stay the same, but we move one note up or down an octave to invert their relative positions, thereby creating a new interval of a different size and quality. The resulting interval and the original interval are said to be inversions of one another. To illustrate this, let's look at the perfect fifth formed between D and A. In order to invert this interval, I'm going to raise the D by an octave. Now, a quick analysis of the new interval formed from A to D reveals a perfect fourth. Or put another way, perfect fifths and perfect fourths are inversions of one another. Every interval has an inversion, and the pairing of inversions are always the same, no matter which two specific pitches are involved. Let's pull up the interval chart for the last time today, and alongside it, I'm going to list the inversions of each interval. There are two important patterns that I want to point out on this chart. First off, let's consider the size of both intervals in each pair of inversions. A unison is always paired with an octave. A second is always paired with a seventh. A third is always paired with a sixth. And a fourth is always paired with a fifth. Together, the sizes also always add up to 9, which we shouldn't be too surprised by, since together, inversions always add up to form an octave. Now, secondly, let's consider the qualities in each of these pairs. Judging by our chart here, a perfect interval always inverts to form another perfect interval. But a major interval always inverts to form a minor interval, and minor intervals invert to form major intervals. Likewise, an augmented interval inverts to become a diminished interval, and vice versa. A diminished interval will invert to form an augmented interval. Now, I think that's a pretty good primer on inversions, and honestly, we won't be focusing on them too much more than that. If you're looking for a challenge, you can craft a good ear training exercise out of singing intervals and then their inversions. But otherwise, we're going to move them to the back burner for a little while. We'll encounter inversions again when we study triads a little later on. Okay, that's a wrap. Today's video brought us full circle on intervals, adding minor, augmented, and diminished intervals to our toolbox. And we completed our intervals chart. On the second half, we outlined the preferred method for building intervals of any size and quality, and we capped it all off with an introduction to inversions. In the next video, we're going to set pitches and intervals aside for a little bit, while we unveil some new concepts in our study of rhythm. We'll also take the performer's perspective on some of the most important musical markings in your part, articulations, and dynamics. Until then, be kind to each other, and thanks for watching.